I'm Sean O'Connell, and this is Robert Bourgeois. Robert is Associate Professor in Humanities and Sociology, and I am in the Philosophy Department, and I'm also the BPA here. So welcome. You'll learn today why I'm not in the classroom anymore now. And he is. But what we're going to do is we want to spend about, I think about 15 minutes apiece, but we really just want to sort of set up and give you some ideas and then open this up so that you can have a dialogue with one another over the topic. I am in philosophy, and when I looked at this question that actually Robert posed, is the narrative of religious witness for human rights, something sometimes called Liberation Theology, a worldview that is important and worth preserving alongside the narratives of consumer capitalism, individual freedom, and national security. I automatically went kind of a really big picture and a little bit abstract, because that's what philosophers do. And so my section's going to be more of a big picture kind of thing, and then Robert really is going to move more into the Dominican Contribution to Liberation Theology. So when I read the question, the thing that popped out to me is that you're talking about two different narrative traditions, really. You know, you're talking about, in some big way, Christianity, and when I looked at the other, I said the Enlightenment and modernity. So the question is really, when you look at these two things, does a narrative coming out of Christianity have something to contribute to this, to where we've kind of gone in modernity? And I decided, at the beginning at least, that I would play devil's advocate and say no for a few minutes. And I'm going to get back to yes by the end, but we'll start with no. So I wanted to think about why is there a movement historically? If you think about when liberation theology starts, right, and you go back to De las Casas and Montesinos, and am I pronouncing them right? Okay. When you look at them 500 years ago, they are in a period where Catholicism and Christianity is really being used to justify the actions of the conquistadors in South America oppressing the Indians, but also to justify a medieval Europe, you know, a feudal system that in many ways supported one group of people, a vested group of people, over other people. And it was really justified in many ways. If you think about it, it was kind of an organic worldview where different people had different places and stations in society, and they were supposed to stay where they were put in those places in society. So the Enlightenment comes along, and it's, in many ways, it's sort of saying no to that. And so what is it saying? Well, the Enlightenment, and I thought about Kant, and you probably had to read him at some point. But in a little essay, what is Enlightenment? Describes Enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. His self-incurred immaturity. And what Kant had in mind was that human beings like authority. We like to be told what to do. It's easy if we're told what to do, you know? Because then, oh, I'm supposed to do that. It's safe. But Kant says, no, you know, in fact, authority is, it really can be a problem, right, when it supports the vested interest. So Kant says we were given reason. We have reason, and we should use our reason. And reason operates in two ways. It both gives us, if you want, a claim on other people. Kant vested ethics in reason. He said, you know, because you are rational animals, you are an end unto yourself, and you are deserving of respect. And that's the basis of his ethic. At the same time, it says, because we are rational, because we are reasonable, we are capable of self-determination. And if you think about the ways that we move to the development of democratic states and the idea of being self-governing, self-determining, that comes out of that idea, that somehow we should be able to rule ourselves. There's a shift, too, if you think about it. I talk about the shift from human nature to human rights. If you go back Pre-modernity, you'll hear a lot about human nature, what's natural, right? And there is also the idea that people, while there may be a human nature, different people actually have different natures to a certain extent. I mean, if you go all the way back to Aristotle, Aristotle says some people were born to be slaves. You know? Some people were born to be free. Human rights goes much more with the idea of, I like thinking of Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes says, and we were born in the state of nature, we have a right to everything. Because there's no private property, no whatever, you know, you have as much right to anything as I have. We enter into society, we give up our rights to everything in order to gain security, in order to gain a space in which we can guarantee a right to life. So we give up some of our rights for rights that we want to protect. So you get the idea of like inalienable right. You have an inalienable right, those are rights you can't give up, right? And you enter into society. So, that all sounds very good. If you look at it right now, the balance seems to be moving towards the Enlightenment and saying, oh, okay, we have to respect people, everybody has equal rights, we should have democracy, life is great. Okay, now the shoe drops a little bit. Because a fundamental aspect of this is recognition. Another one of my favorite philosophers, Hegel, says that what human beings desire, most desire, is a recognition of their right to be free. So all of this is based on a recognition of what? A recognition of your human dignity, that you are a human being, right? And if we look at modernity, yes, that's been a big play in modernity, but also there's a big play in modernity is to say that that some people aren't people. In other words, there's a dehumanizing aspect to modernity as well. So if you look at in the United States and slavery in the United States, right, part of it was slaves are not real people. They're not human beings. You know, they'll pull on neo-Darwinism and Herbert Spencer and people like that to say, oh, no, you know, they don't have any rights. And I mean, it's rather interesting. If you looked at slavery in South America, it was a different mindset of what it meant to be a slave. It actually built into the human nature side, and they would say, okay, slaves have a right to marry, for instance, and we recognize their marriages. But in North America, they didn't, because if they did, they'd have to say they were human beings. So the big thing was, you're not human, therefore you have no rights. If you look at the Holocaust, again, great example. Holocaust is very interesting because the Jews in Germany, they had to be denied their citizenship first. So their citizenship was taken away so that they were non-persons in the state. And then it was possible to say, okay, you can put them in concentration camps and you can do whatever you want with them, right? I was also thinking about the feminist movements, whatever. I'm in a room where I'm terribly outnumbered. All right.
Just feminism. Just be
feminism. There we go. One of the interesting, if you look at a feminist like great French feminist Lucie Rougaray, who says, you know, if you think about it, the subject, the rational subject, the person of reason, is gendered as male. So if you think about, oh, men are rational, women are emotional, right? And the idea women can't be self-governing because they aren't reasonable, all those kinds of arguments, I feel like I can
Goodbye.
So what's my point? Well, right now, where are we at this point? Well, Christian narratives have the potential to be slanted, to be used for oppressive purposes. Enlightenment narratives have the potential to be slanted and used for oppressive purposes. That's where I'm at right now. And so, I wanted to bring up, well, what's been the response to Enlightenment? Because a lot of, in the 20th century and on into the 21st century, there's been a sort of suspicion of this appeal to the rational subject. Is it really rational? And we have a movement, and how many of you heard about postmodernism? In culture at some point. Postmodernism is really a push to say, you know, we have to be very careful about the claims we make for the narratives we use. When we claim that a narrative is an absolute narrative, we can move towards totalitarianism. We can move towards oppression. What you have to recognize is narratives have this human dimension. Human beings are part of what's involved in making up these narratives. And so they're very suspicious of narratives. And in fact, if you look at sort of the precursors to postmodernism, there would be Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. There we go. Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, who all say, look at the ideology that's on the surface, right? And then look below it, and you'll find that there are all these interests at play that are building these narratives and then using them to support the status quo. So there's a real suspicion of narratives, and a lot of times postmodernity then is tagged with being relativist, it's saying, no, all narratives are the same, or with being nihilistic, that there's nothing, that type of thing. But there's another side to postmodernism, and I would say that it's a side that lines up with the sacred and with an idea of mystery, a recognition that human beings are finite and they have to be very careful of the claims they make. And so some folks that I would put along that line of this postmodernism, I want to take two things and put them together. One is a theorist that I actually wrote my dissertation on, Paul Ricoeur, who was a French theorist. And he said, you know what you have to attend to is the poetic dimension of language. And this goes back, narratives are language, right? Narratives are dialogue or a form of discourse. He says, when you look at a narrative, you shouldn't be asking the question whether or not it tells you something true in the sense of points to a reality. Most of you, I bet, you had your Thomism when you were here. You had to be studying Thomas Aquinas, right? Okay, so in Aquinas, you would have a correspondence theory of truth. Statement corresponds to reality, right? In Ricoeur makes the point with narratives that narratives actually open up or disclose something. They do have a referential function, but what they disclose is a possibility for being in the world, a way of being with others. And maybe not the way, but a way. And different narratives will open up different possibilities. If you think about it, if you didn't have an idea of democracy, an idea of the way the United States is, then you couldn't function, right? I mean, the idea actually brings about the reality to a certain extent. So I want to bring that together with another modern theorist, Emmanuel Levinas. And Levinas' claim is that ethics precedes ontology. Ethics precedes ontology. And what he means by that is that prior to any language, prior to any narrative, the experience, the primordial experience we have of one another is to experience the face of the other. And in a very kind of almost romantic, poetic way, he says, you know, when I am confronted by the other and I really am aware of the other, there's one command they make of me, the command, thou shalt not kill. And all narratives then, for Levinas, are born or are human attempts to be able to respond to that call which we can never really fully realize because it's made by everybody on each of us, right? So it seems to me that opens up a kind of an interesting possibility. Forms of Christianity can become totalitarian. Forms of enlightenment can become totalitarian. But if we have the humility to recognize the nature of our narratives and the demands our narratives are making on us for justice, then it opens us up to be able to kind of move forward. And I thought, by the way, where are the Dominicans? So let me throw a Dominican in at the end of this, because there is a point. I was reading a little bit about De Las Casas, and I'm no expert at all, but one of the things that I thought was really interesting about this guy is that he pulls on the Renaissance. He pulls on Thomas More and Erasmus, and he bases his claims to the conquistadors that they should not be doing what they're doing on the idea that the Indians have a right to self-determination because they're reasonable. And yet De Las Casas was deeply steeped in, I mean, he's a Dominican, he's got this tradition of Christianity behind him, and he ties it very much into the idea that each of us is in the image of God, and that we have a responsibility because we are born in the image of God to respect one another. And so he brings together, in a way, he listens to the different narratives, right? And he's trying to bring these things together in a way that both appeals to people who may not believe, may have very different kinds of beliefs, but also to recognize the truth of the Christian tradition in what he's saying. So probably I should leave it at that. There's one other thing. No, I guess that's it. All right. So I think at that point I'll just turn it over to Robert, and he's going to talk a lot more about the Dominican Contribution.
Good afternoon. We're both very honored to be with the alumni of Albertus Magnus College. In some ways, it's the most intimidating possible audience I could have, knowing how you were trained. So you're going to push us to do our best. So I want to talk about liberation theology. And I'm dividing my remarks into several parts. And in the first place, I want to use a bridge into discussing liberation theology by responding to Sean O'Connell's philosophical reflections on the question that I posed in the materials that were sent out. By the way, did folks get a chance to read those materials, or should I not assume that?
No.
No, okay.
We just got it.
All right, okay. There was a very school teacher-like email that went out that said, have you done your homework? Here are the materials. But I'm gonna read, if I may then, the first document to set the stage for what I want to talk about. The first is a quotation. By what right do you wage such detestable wars on these people who lived mildly and peacefully in their own lands? Why do you so greatly oppress and fatigue them, not giving them enough to eat or caring for them when they fall ill from excessive labors, so that they die, or rather are slain by you, so that you may extract and acquire gold every day? And what care do you take that they receive religious instruction and come to know their God and Creator, or that they be baptized, hear Mass, or observe holy days and Sundays? Are they not human beings? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not bound to love them as you love yourselves? These words come from the sermon by Dominican friar Antonio de Montesinos on December 21st, 1511. So we're pretty close to 500 years from that date. The Dominicans just celebrated the 500th anniversary of the presence of the Dominicans in the Americas. So this world-changing event of the discovery of America, which for the first time brought the entire world into a single global network, the Dominicans were there at that moment. The sermon precipitated a debate about the human rights of the indigenous peoples and peasants of Latin America that has lasted 500 years. In a secular age, with increasing numbers of Americans deracinated from the humanistic and Christian traditions that sustained their ancestors, people are free to abandon the faith of their forebears and to criticize their inherited religious traditions. Many consider organized Christianity to be at least irrelevant, at best irrelevant, and at worst harmful. The case of Latin America permits an examination of the relevance of Christianity in a context outside our own society. The Catholic Church, as part of the establishment of Spanish America, was complicit in the subjugation of the poor by the oligarchy. But that same church raised up prophets and martyrs for human rights from the earliest decades of the conquest to the present day. The question we would like to raise today is whether the discourse of religious witness on behalf of human rights is important, irrelevant, or harmful in the Latin American context? The answer to that question has ramifications beyond Latin America. Prominent cultural mythologies or worldviews which shape our perceptions in the United States include individualism, consumer capitalism, the American creed centered on freedom and opportunity, and the national interest. Is the narrative of religious witness for human rights, sometimes called liberation theology, a worldview that is important and worth preserving, alongside the narratives of consumer capitalism, individual freedom, and national security? This question is the topic of the reunion seminar. So, when I was young, there was no question. I lived in a completely Catholic world. I mean, there were non-Catholics present, but there was no question about my identity. No doubt about my identity. No conception that I would ever change it. But students coming today aren't like that. They live in the postmodern world, and they're looking and waiting and testing all narratives on their own. I have great compassion because in a lot of ways they're kind of having to make things up as they go along. They don't have something to fall back on and to lean on. So I would say that in theology, and I'm not a theologian, but my impression, all right, is that in theology, the same movement toward postmodernism is occurring as has occurred in philosophy, outlined by Sean O'Connell. That is to say that there is among the theologians who are on the cutting edge, and it's very exciting. It looks to me to be very exciting to be in theology today. When I'm around theologians, I get seized with theology envy. We've had since Sister Ann Gilbride has been here, we've been fortunate that Dominican theologians have been visiting us and sharing what they're doing right now. But my point is that that there's a tendency to borrow from philosophy, to engage in a hermeneutics of suspicion and a hermeneutics of retrieval. What does that mean? The hermeneutics of suspicion tends to reject a theological framework of God that does not correspond to what we know today and what we feel morally today about the universe story, about human rights, about the inclusion of women, about oppression. So it tends to reject metaphors of God that might encourage such things. And the hermeneutics of retrieval is looking back at the tradition and pulling out of it those things which seem more adequately to address the realities of today. So one of these is liberation theology. So I want to discuss now the Dominican contribution to human rights and Christian witness in the 16th century. So along with the conquistadors, an epic event, came the Christian missionaries, and among them prominently the Dominicans. I'll just say some of the underlying assumptions within Christian and specifically Dominican discourse, I would say. Number one, the priority of God's grace. Edward Stilebex writes, this is number one in the Dominican way, to have complete trust and to focus more on the other than on the self, more on God than on the self, and that this gives way to a tranquil and serene spirituality. I love that. Openness of tradition to current reality. So we have a tradition, but it's got to be relevant because the world is changing all the time. And so the Dominicans are always engaged, as must people in any great tradition, with discerning in what way that tradition applies to current day realities. Dialogue and discovery, very important to the Dominicans. Finding God in the wilderness, I'm going to come back, but the Dominicans are open to the Word of God, not necessarily requiring the gospel, the sacraments, or dogma, but God is present everywhere, and one must be attentive to that Word of God. It can come right out of the wilderness. Integration, meaning it's not faith versus reason, it's faith and reason. It's not human versus divine, it's human and divine. The Dominicans tend to have an integrative approach to things that bring the aspects of reality together. I'll go right to the last two. A wonderful Dominican named Timothy Radcliffe, who just stepped down as the master of the Order of all Dominicans worldwide, an urbane, sophisticated, joyful man, wrote a book called What's the Point of Being a Christian? He says, if you're a Christian, it should be noticeable. It should be something a little strange about you. You must have great joy and great freedom. And we should go back to our founding narrative of the Last Supper, when Jesus freely and joyfully gave his body and blood to his friends. That's the ultimate freedom. The ultimate freedom. And it's very relevant to liberation theology. So, Pedro de Cordova and 25 Dominicans came. They needed a lot of courage for this. And their job was to minister to the conquistadors. But what they noticed is that the conquistadors, who were supposed to be responsible for educating the Indians in the faith, were oppressing them, enslaving them, raping them, mutilating them, burning them, killing them, enslaving them, putting them into mines. And so the Dominicans were horrified, and they got together and they said, we have to respond to this. We must respond to this. So let's think about this. So they thought about what it means to be a Christian and a Dominican, and decided to make a response to the conquistadors. This was a very, very, very religious society. Spaniards were very religious, militantly Catholic, but deeply Catholic. And so they decided to elect Antonio de Montesinos to give the sermon, in which he was going to give them a lecture, because he was the best speaker. And he got up in what is now the Dominican Republic, Hispaniola, and he said, all of you are in the state of mortal sin. How can you do this? How can you do what you're doing to these people? Are they not human beings? I just quoted to you from that sermon. And they were enraged. Diego Colon, the son of Christopher Columbus, was there. And they were enraged, and they went to the chief authorities, and they wanted the Dominicans sent back. They eventually did get sent back, got to speak to the king, and were sent back again. And with rules that would limit the harm done to the Indians. Two others, Dominicans, great Dominicans that are important to us through the ages are Francisco de Vitoria. He was founder of a Dominican school in Salamanca, and he taught philosophy. He dealt with questions like the right of conquest, the temporal powers of the Pope, did they even exist? And matters that pertain to what they were doing there, to their experience in Latin America. He stayed in Salamanca, but the Dominicans who were having the experience here would write back to Salamanca and say, here's the way we responded. Are we on the right track? So they were collaborating in that wonderful combination, Dominican combination of contemplation and reality and experience. And Bartolomé de las Casas was a gentleman cleric. He was not a Dominican. When he came to the New World, he owned slaves and an encomienda, which was a Spanish system whereby you were granted some land, and with that land, you were granted the labor without pay of a number of indigenous peoples. So again, essentially you had free labor. And that's what the Spaniards wanted. They wanted gold, land, and free labor. So de las Casas had his own encomienda. And then during the conquest of Cuba, he got another encomienda. But it was there that he was horrified by what he saw, by the savagery and the rapacity of the conquistadors toward the Indians. This is a statue on Hispaniola of Montesinos. Tell me by what right of justice you hold these Indians in such a cruel and horrible servitude. This is, I won't read it all because this is what I quoted to you before. Wonderful statue of him. One result was that King Ferdinand II decreed the Laws of Burgos, which was the first code that would protect the indigenous people. So the Dominicans had an impact immediately. They took the side of the Indians. And they had a lot of trouble because of that. I say here it's the beginning of 300 years of Dominican priority of the defense of the Aboriginal inhabitants of Latin America. It's not an unbroken good record. Nobody's record in Latin America is an unbroken good record. But it's a record of great brilliance and inspiration. Vitoria, that is a statue, I don't know if you can see it, but that's a bust of Vitoria. Vitoria, that bust is in a garden right outside the United Nations, where he is credited with being the founder of international law and human rights. So quite a distinction. He's considered one of the founders of international law, along with Alberto Gentili and Hugo Grotius. Dominican principles. Montesinos, listen to this voice crying in the wilderness. He announces in his sermon, I'm like a voice crying in the wilderness. This is going to be hard. And in the Dominican way, the Word of God is not only found in the pulpit and the gospel, but in the wilderness. It didn't occur to anybody. You have to sort of use an act of the imagination. It didn't occur to anybody that the Indians should be accorded the same rights as the Spaniards. It just was inconceivable. But that's where they found God. So this was a subversion of the order. They found God in the voice of the Indians. Thomas Aquinas says, it is by reason of the unity of matter and spirit in the human person that human beings know God and are able to participate in the divine plan and in the life of the divine. So there's an incarnational aspect that's really come back in theology these days, that God is in everything, and God is in human beings, and God is dwelling in the Indians too. They are capable of seeing the face of God. Francisco de Vitoria, nature has established a bond of relationship between all human beings. On the basis of this shared humanity, all people had claim to rights which protected them and from which they could never be alienated. So this sounds obvious today. This is this language of human rights today. But this was radical and unheard of at the time. Bartolomé de las Casas lived a long life, a prolific writer, tireless advocate for the indigenous. His two most famous books are a short account of the destruction of the Indies and the Historia de las Indias, in which he chronicles the first decades of the conquest and the brutality of the conquistadors. He was the first one named to ever be given the title Protector of the Indians. As a result of his work, slavery and the encomienda system were outlawed in the Spanish territories. This is a painting of torture of the Indians during the conquest of Cuba. His work was translated, it was a bestseller and translated into various languages in Europe. This was included in a Protestant publication because they were interested in generating bad publicity for the Catholics. But this corresponds exactly to the writings of Las Casas. If you read through Las Casas, it's withering to read. And Las Casas he was in the audience and heard the Montesinos sermon, but he wasn't converted right away. Las Casas was later converted when he was asked on Cuba to say Mass. And in preparing to say Mass, he read from Ecclesiastes, in which God said, if you come and make a sacrifice to me with bread that has been stolen from the weak and the poor, then this is an abomination to me. And this hit Las Casas hard, he said, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm about to take the bread of communion, and that's been stolen from the Indians that we have enslaved, and he refused to say Mass. He couldn't do it. He underwent a conversion, and he later joined the Dominicans. And even though he was very learned, the Dominicans required him to go through their entire course of study. I thought you'd feel good about that. Here are some words of Bartolomé de las Casas. The pattern established at the outset has remained to this day, and the Spaniards still do nothing save tear the natives to shreds, murder them, and inflict upon them untold misery, suffering, distress, tormenting, harrying, and persecuting them mercilessly. In another place he says, dogs are treated much better than Indians here. And he proposed, so one of the things that Vitoria wrote about was, do the Spaniards have a right to wage war on the Indians because they're refusing the faith? And Vitoria destroyed this argument, and he said even if it were true that you have right to wage war on the Indians because they are resisting the faith. And what did they resist? The faith has never been preached to them. All that has been done is to despoliate and harass them. So Las Casas proposed a peaceful evangelization, and he was ridiculed for this by the conquistadors. He set up a utopian community, you mentioned Thomas More, along the lines of Thomas More, and it failed, and he was ridiculed. But he realized that he hadn't been thorough enough. He hadn't been total enough. So he began to have areas marked out for the Dominicans alone, and there'd be no conquistadors there. And they would invite people to hear the gospel. And that turned out to be successful. It turned out to be true that one did not have to wage war to spread the gospel. I know this sounds like an absurdly obvious assertion, but he was ridiculed for thinking otherwise. So there was, it was an honest question to Europeans as to whether these people, these indigenous peoples of Latin America, were really human, fully human or not. And so the Dominicans made a strong, what's the word I'm looking for? Unambiguous case for their humanity. Okay, so what I just did was I gave a brief introduction to the contribution that the Dominicans made. And this is the entire history of Latin America since that time, over 500 years to today. So this is what I call a swift journey. I wanted to mention the Jesuit reducciones in the 18th century. I heard one of you here talking about the film The Mission. The Mission is a more or less true account of an incredible development in Latin America. The Jesuits, the word reducciones, meaning reductions, were actually, they were walled towns in which the indigenous peoples were not enslaved, and they were protected from the slavers from both Portugal and Spain. And it occupied the territory of all of present-day Paraguay, if you can believe this, and substantial parts of Brazil, Bolivia, and Argentina. This was vast. This lasted for over 150 years. The Jesuits ran a massive territory. It was like a Jesuit country. And the indigenous were taught to farm, and they were taught masonry, and they were taught woodworking, and they were taught painting. They could make statues. They made instruments that were sent back to Europe to use to play Baroque music. They were taught polyphonic music. So it was like this was the Jesuit utopia. It was paternalistic in a way that wouldn't be approved of today, but no one was being enslaved, no one was being murdered, and they kept their own traditions. This was true also of Las Casas' areas where he and his associates were in charge. The Indians there became Christian, but they didn't give up their own culture. And those groups lasted, the Christianity there lasted. So it showed that acculturation to European ways need not accompany evangelization. Okay, so he was really ahead of his time. Latin America has a violent history, beautiful, wonderful, immense land. The achievement of the Spaniards is unbelievable. Little band of men conquered an area 2.5 times the size of Europe and put their stamp on it all over. Every town, from California to Tierra del Fuego has the stamp. And by and large, they've retained the faith. So it's quite an achievement. But the inequality in the access to resources has been a constant cause of violence. Between 5 and 20% of the population own between 80 to 95% of the resources, depending on which country you're in. Mexico is a good example of Mexico's history. And there has been a history of trampling on the rights of the campesinos, not to mention the indigenous, who don't have any pieces of paper. They just run off the land whenever it suits some developer. And even after independence, which occurred in the 1820s, after independence of the Latin nation, they absorbed liberal ideas like free markets, private property, liberalism. But that didn't help the indigenous at all. The idea was, well, if we have free markets and individual ownership of land, instead of doing it the way the indigenous do, among the indigenous, the whole community owns the land. It's communally owned. This was felt to be inefficient, and that the land would be more productive if we introduced private ownership. But what that resulted in was that communally owned land was just taken away from the Indians, and they would wake up the next day and find out that they were now day laborers on the land that their ancestors had owned. So that's a little brief overview of, obviously this is gross big picture, leaving out a lot of details, but it's a theme that I think most people would agree is not false about the history of Latin America. So I want to talk now about liberation theology. Some of its principles are that the church must identify with the poor, and the Dominicans were very strong on this from the beginning. And they were told in a letter before they got here from their superior, do not go and own land, go with nothing. You will only have freedom if you go with nothing. Once you start acquiring things, especially gold and silver, you're going to lose your souls. And remember, your job is to minister to the Indians who have been mistreated. And it reads the Bible from the Old Testament all the way through the New as an injunction by God warning us, warning humanity to treat the poor well. Dire warnings all through the prophets, wisdom, the Psalms, and the New Testament more so. Now, liberation theology has been criticized by critics within the church as being too political, reducing religion to politics, and to be tinged with Marxism. So I would say this, that what liberation theology and Marxism have in common is that they analyze the structure of society. They analyze whose interests are at stake in policy. But liberation theology must begin with the nature of God. And Marxism is about social structure and class interests, and is completely secular and hostile to religion, because it views religion as Marx so famously said, the opium of the people. It'll keep the poor quiet, and we can give them a few crumbs and they'll be happy. They won't give us any trouble. Before any action, the question liberation theologians want to ask is, are we in collusion? Are we implicated in injustice or not? Are we implicated in injustice toward the poor? This is old 1989, but the picture hasn't changed much. If anything, it's probably a little more extreme now. This is reproduced in Elizabeth Johnson's book, The Quest for the Living God. She's a theologian at Fordham. But what you see here is that the top 20% of the world own 82% of the world's resources. The bottom 20% have access to 1.4% of its resources. So these are quintiles: 20%, fourth 20%, third 20%, second 20%, top 20%. So extreme inequality. Some of the heroes, not the heroes, the founders, let's say the modern founders of liberation theology. I would say that Las Casas is considered by many the father of liberation theology, ahead of his time. But the modern exponents, Gustavo Gutierrez, a Dominican, he's Peruvian, he's born in 1928. Right now he is at Notre Dame University, where he teaches a course every spring in liberation theology. He's of mixed Quechua and Spanish descent. His landmark book was called A Theology of Liberation, History, Politics, and Salvation, 1971. Another book on Job, and another book, Las Casas, In Search of the Poor of Jesus Christ. And afterwards, when we get to talk, I have these books up here if you want to take a look at them. He wrote, "Poverty is not fate, it is a condition. It is not a misfortune, it is an injustice. It is the result of social structures and mental and cultural categories. It is linked to the way in which society has been built in its various manifestations." So this is very characteristic of liberation theology. Liberation theology says that in addition to personal sin, there is structural sin, or sometimes called social sin. And that refers to political structures, economic, legal, social structures, which have the effect of systematically depriving large categories of people of their rights. That's called social or structural sin. So that it's not enough to say, I'm obeying the law. That's why Martin Luther King wrote from the Birmingham jail, "You're accusing me of breaking the law, but we respect the law. But we distinguish between just laws and unjust laws." So liberation theology asks us to make that kind of an analysis. In the Bible, poverty is a...
That is national security and human rights. And my feeling is that, I feel pretty cynical, I guess, that it's almost impossible to have human rights in a framework in which national security allows almost anything. And you have people in Guantanamo, you have people dispossessed in African countries, Latin American countries, in communities where something is going to happen if we don't increase our security or national security. So, a lot of rights get whittled away that way. Some of them more drastically and dramatically, perhaps sometimes. But anyway, as philosophers and historians, what do you think about those things? What do you think about them?
Well, I think you said something
Human rights and national security. It seems to me there's a lot of incompatibility.
Yeah, I agree, and we can see that in the enormous influence of the United States and Central America, for example. We trained people who became at the School of the Americas in Georgia, who then went back to work for their governments, and they were killing the very people we saw in El Salvador, for example. So you're right, there is, in fear will trump everything. People are afraid. Most people by the wayside. That's why these people are so courageous. We can't just let die. We can't just let the voice of the voiceless die. Yes? I didn't answer your question well. I agree there's a conflict, and they're incompatible. And an emphasis on national security tends to swamp concern for human rights. It's a big challenge.
But I think one of the things too is to think about what really, it's such a complicated issue, but what really provides you with national security in the long run. Because if true or not, the United States has lost a lot of credibility over these issues, and that can cause real damage to national security. So I mean, I do see them as kind of, you're usually better off trying to do the right thing. I'm very naive, but at the end of the day, in the long term, I think you're shooting yourself in the foot if you don't stand by whatever the core. It's true of any institution. If an institution strays too far from its mission, then it just can't survive, and it's not gonna, it has to become something else totally, or it goes out of existence. And I think that's true for the United States. If we don't hold on to a kind of a core set of principles and values, even if it's hard, then we lose sight of who we are, and we just we don't have an identity.
Sir.
Can I raise a point about, it seems to me that liberation theology is rather hostile to socialism. And there are Christian socialists, it's a form of socialism, and there are many secular groups which have religious people within it. And it seems to me also that if you have liberation theology Catholics, they've got to find allies somewhere. And the allies include groups like Amnesty International and so on. And they're groups that are made up of secular people, many of whom are religious in their own way. So I don't think there's any incompatibility there. And the other thing has to do with, I'm outside of the Catholic Church.
For those things which we have in common. And I would hope that what you said is not true. It's disappointing if it is true. I would think that those would be natural allies.
They were in Nicaragua.
Huh?
I mean, there were so many priests in Nicaragua who were socialists and communists, and they were connected very tightly.
Priests and nuns picked up guns. So that was going over the line, and that was like a red flag. But you're right. Pope Francis hasn't used that phrase, but he uses the lingo. He uses the lingo in the 2007 Conference of Latin American Bishops. He said that things are more unequal in Argentina than they've ever been, and this is a great social sin which cries out to the heavens for redress. He uses phrases like that. And in his inaugural Mass, he called for two things: care of the poor and care of the environment. And he mentioned the environment 3 times. This was not a throwaway phrase. So I think liberation theology and environmental activists are kind of forming a bond. And I think that's a positive sign. As far as the problems of the Catholic Church are concerned, yes, they are legion. We do have that structure. The sexual abuse scandal is a great sorrow and a great shame, great scandal. And we do have that hierarchical structure, and a lot of people felt that the transition in Vatican II to a view of the Church as the people of God would flatten that out. And there seems in the last quarter of a century, on the contrary, to be kind of a retrenchment and a pulling in. So I'm still here because I just can't change my stripes. There's too much in it that's great. From the you're talking about what it looks like from the outside. From the inside, it's beautiful. It has fissures and tensions, but it's like seeing a great cathedral from the outside versus the inside, where the light comes through the stained glass windows. There's a great deal of beauty and richness and tradition in it. But that is not to deny these problems. They are frustrating. The hierarchical structure in the Church has, I guess it has positives and negatives. That you've laid out some of the negatives. It uses its power to silence people, then they get rehabilitated. On the other hand, as part of its resilience, it's still around after 2,000 years, and it's a repository of great richness. So we're working for the richness. But thank you, I appreciate those comments very much.
Maybe one more. You're kind of.
I was just curious to know whether the School of the Americas had been shut down.
No, it's changed its name. It's got a very long name now.
She was asking if the School of the Americas is shut down.
We missed the question.
So she asked, has the School of the Americas in Georgia been shut down?
Oh.
But in response to because the newspapers started to figure this out, the connection, and see who was being trained and what they did after they got trained. So it was getting a bad reputation. And so they changed the name to the Western Hemispheric Institute on Cooperative Relations or something like that.
Do they do the same thing?
And well, they say now their emphasis is on human rights. They do have an 8-hour program on human rights, but the rest of the time is spent with guns and, you know.
And are you two professors here? Is it
Yes.
in the philosophy?
Robert is in humanities and
Oh, right.
sociology, and I'm in philosophy and religious studies.
I'm an anthropologist by training, but it's wonderful to be here because.
Well, I think the students are very lucky to have you. And we're very lucky.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
agree. I want to just say one thing. The lady who left is part of the class of 1948, as are these two ladies, and she requested through Carolyn, who I don't know her last name,
Yeah.
to have this lecture. She was very upset that the main lecture seemed to be about makeup. She worked hard with Carolyn to get this, so I just wanted, her name is Ann Arcudi. So we're calling this the Arcudi Lecture Series.
Well, we're sorry we weren't able to give you beauty tips today.
The last thing we need.
This is inner beauty tips.
None of us need beauty.